Alright, so we're continuing to read Capital. This time we're in, what was it? Chapter 1, Section 2, Subsection B. Quantitative determination of relative value. Last time, the last section was frankly way too long for what it was really saying. Mainly that the whole thing about the equivalent form, that you can only have. This happens when you try to see the value from the perspective of one commodity. You can't really see it in general. There is nothing like price yet. There is no money, so you can't have this third thing. So the third thing can only be expressed as, this thing you call value, but it only appears as the other in the relation of commodities. So you have a coat is worth 2 gloves or something. Well, the equivalent form is the coat. The relative form is 2 gloves. That is because it's not the case that goddamn, or maybe I'm switching it around. Either way, it doesn't fucking matter. It's a really autistic distinction, which ultimately is worthless. It only works for dialectics, and it's not really something important. There was some stuff about the labor theory of value. Most important was that he says that human labor power in motion or human labor creates value, but is not itself value. It becomes value only in its congealed state when embodied in the form of some object. But alright, let's continue.
Alright.
Subsection B, quantitative determination of relative value. Every commodity whose value it is intended to express is a useful object of given quantity, as 15 bushels of corn or 100 pounds of coffee. And a given quantity of any commodity contains a definite quantity of human labor. The value form must therefore not only express value generally, but also value in definite quantity. Therefore, in the value relation of commodity A to commodity B of the linen of the coat, not only is the latter, as value in general, made the equal in quality of the linen, but a definite quantity of coat, 1 coat, is made the equivalent of a definite quantity of linen, 20 yards of linen. The equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, implies that the same quantity of value substance, congealed labor, is embodied in both. That the two commodities have each cost the same amount of labor, of the same quantity of labor time. But the labor time necessary for the production of 20 yards of linen, or 1 coat, varies with every change in the productiveness of weaving or tailoring. We have now to consider the influence of such changes in the quantitative aspect of the relative expression of value. One, let the value of the linen vary, that of the coat remaining constant. If, say, in consequence of the exhaustion of flax-growing soil, the labor time necessary for the production of the linen be doubled, the value of the linen will also be doubled. Instead of the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, we should have 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats. since one coat would now contain only half the labor time embodied in 20 yards of linen. If, on the other hand, in consequence, say, of improved looms, this labor time be reduced by one half, the value of the linen would fall by one half. Consequently, we should have 20 yards of linen equals one half coat. The relative value of commodity A, that is, its value, expressed in commodity B, rises and falls directly as the value of A, the value of B being supposed constant. And I'm not going to bother reading that second one. It's a repetition.
These are all just examples of what
Yeah,
it be. Okay.
3. Let the quantities of labor time respectively necessary for the production of linen in the coat vary simultaneously in the same direction and in the same proportion. In this case, 20 yards of linen continue to equal one coat, however much their values may have altered. Their change of value is seen as soon as they are compared with a third commodity whose value has remained constant.
So if a price fluctuates, then it's no longer worth the 20 yards of linen because the coat went up in price or whatever.
Well, that's the
So
first
now
one.
it's not worth that. Yeah,
But
yeah.
the third one is if the price is not the price, but if the labor time fluctuates equally for both, where it becomes twice as hard to grow linen, but it's also twice as hard to make shoes, then the relative value will remain the same, and you can't tell that a value has changed, except with comparing it to something which hasn't changed.
See, now that makes me think about Bitcoin, because the way you mine these Bitcoins and any other shit coins and stuff is based on how many people are pulling into itself, and the difficulty rises, right? So difficulty in labor of growing like linen and like any other like commodity like that should relatively stay the same, because ultimately it's the same processes. Unless the only way you can make it, you can't make it harder on yourself to make plants and other commodities, right? The only way to go up is by making it easier. The opposite is true in these cryptocurrencies, where the only way up is by increasing the difficulty in which people mine things, so that produces like artificial scarcity and whatnot. So
it's just an increase in number of people doing it, right?
Well, yes, but then there's an algorithm in place where, depending on how many people are mining at a given time versus actual difficulty in which it is to calculate these SSH hashes and stuff, it's like the difficulty grows, the difficulty increases or decreases based on that. So that's interesting. I don't know. I just thought that'd be a little bit relevant.
Well, yeah, I mean,
That's like a way. That's like the opposite of how it's supposed to work.
the thing is, okay, like the labor, what could even be considered to be called labor within Bitcoins is basically number crunching. You could like there's a video of somebody literally doing a hash by hand. The hash solution.
That's like a 7-minute thing. I remember that.
Yeah, a hash solution. So the calculations your computer runs represent that much amount of human labor or whatever, just crunching numbers for no other reason than to produce a thing called a Bitcoin. But Bitcoin itself has no value other than the fact that it relates to other currencies.
No, of course. And the only reason why even it has value is because it relates itself to USD. So it's not.
And people who accept it.
Yeah, the people who accept it. But it's not actually useful in itself, other than the technology behind it. But that's just technology. But I just figured that you still have to. So I mean, the computer has to labor for these things. It just labors in a different way than we would normally labor for things that we want.
Yeah,
based according to this book.
It's a gold currency type of thing, which is
yeah,
which has its problems, and that there's a reason gold currency was abandoned, and logically it just makes no sense. Why in the world would you want to have a restricted currency, especially when you want to do planning, for example. People don't think about this, but for our current economies, if our if our countries weren't stupid, everybody would realize that every country basically has an absolute control of its own internal economy, where whatever needs to get done in the U.S. with the resources of the U.S. can be done by the U.S. with no debt necessary to anybody else. The U.S. can literally just print money and say, we're going to get $10 trillion worth of infrastructure just built here right now.
Yeah.
With the stuff we have. And they can do it, and it would not devalue anything because it would be real labor. It would be real value. It's necessary. And nobody would lose a thing. So, this whole like, oh, but money's only, it needs to be rare. No, it doesn't.
It needs to be rare for speculation. That's all it is.
Yeah, it needs to be rare for so that inflation and runaway speculation doesn't happen. But for like the work that actually gets done and the representation of that work, literally the government could just fucking command it and do it.
My only argument against that is that once you get into like a metropolitan area, like a Miami or New York, Las Vegas, wherever it is, when you still need to do development, yeah, ultimately you're producing something that is not made for debt, but you got to be looking at towards what you'll be losing at the same time for development, because eminent domain is a thing and it's widely used for everything, and so you lose like livable homes and stuff like that for the purpose of like making a like a highway. Where are these people moving after after you just created your highway on top of their homes? You're displacing several hundreds of people, etc. So that in itself that's a negative growth, because if you're not thinking of like profits and stuff like that, that's not something that you'd want. You gotta find granted, it's a false equivalence because the law, quote unquote, and makes you gives you value based on what the home that you lose, and you gain another house based on that, and so on and so forth. But I know it's a very difficult and arduous process, and like it's something that most people don't want to deal with, or they can't deal with it, or something like that. I don't know.
Well,
So
they have to give you like ample time though. I mean, like years time, right? Before like they fucking just go and okay, we're gonna mow your house down.
I think they give you like maybe like a couple of years. Like the soonest I've seen it was like maybe it's like 6 months in terms of any actual development happening. But still, it's to look for a home, to move your family from one home to the other, to then figure out if you have to like leave your job to get another job. Which getting a job in this economy is even harder than it sounds, and moving your kids to a different school, etc. So it's it's more process than that, and in itself, if you count human capital, that's a net loss, because these are people that could be productive otherwise.
Well, yeah, but you can shift it around. Like, I mean, ideally, it doesn't really provide much of a problem. It's just something that can be managed. But that's getting off topic for what we're reading.
Oh yeah.
So, continuing to
4. If we compare the different cases examined under headings 1 and 2, it emerges that the same change in the magnitude of relative value may arise from entirely opposed causes. Is that where we left off, or no?
No,
4.
He skipped that to go to 4.
We skipped that to go to 4? Okay.
Yeah, he read.
Okay. So I see it here.
Now we're on 4.
The labor time respectively necessary for the production of the linen and the coat, and therefore the value of these commodities, may simultaneously vary in the same direction, but at unequal rates, or in opposite directions, or in other ways. The effect of these possible different variations on the relative value of a commodity may be deduced from the results of 1, 2, and 3. Thus, real changes in the magnitude of value are neither unequivocally nor exhaustively reflected in their relative expression, that is, in the equation expressing the magnitude of relative value. The relative value of a commodity may vary, although its value remains constant. Its relative value may remain constant, although its value varies. And finally, simultaneous variations in the magnitude of value and in that of its relative expression by no means necessarily corresponds in amount. So that's something to keep in mind of interest, in which
you have a footnote 21?
What?
Do you have a footnote 21?
I haven't reread the footnotes, because
okay.
this one doesn't have on the bottom of the page, and I'm not about to be flipping through to the end of the chapter and back.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
Okay.
You just control 20, press 21, and then I could read it if you want. I mean,
I don't know. Does it seem like anything interesting? Unless it's something that's actually expanding.
It says here, the vulgar economists have exploited this lack of congruence between the magnitude of value and its relative expressions with their customary ingenuity. For example, once admit that A falls because B, with which it is exchanged rises, while no less labor is bestowed in the meantime on A, and your general principle of value falls on the ground. If he, Ricardo, allowed that when A rises in value relatively to B, B falls in value relatively to A, he cut away the ground on which he rested his grand proposition that the value of a commodity is ever determined by the labor embodied in it. For if a change in the cost of A alters not only its own value in relation to B, for which it is exchanged, but also the value of B relatively to that of A, though no change has taken place in the quantity of labor to produce B, then not only the doctrine falls to the ground, which asserts that the quantity of labor bestowed on an article regulates its value, but also that which affirms the cost of an article to regulate its value. There's a John Broadhurst, Political Economy, London, 1842, etc.
Yeah.
Mr. Broadhurst might just as well say, consider the fractions 10 to 20, 10 to 50, 10 to 100, etc. The number 10 remains unchanged, and it is proportional magnitude. Its magnitude in relation to the numbers 20, 50, and 10 continually diminishes. Therefore, the great principle that the magnitude of a whole number, such as 10, is regulated by the number of times the number 1 is contained in it falls to the ground. Yeah.
Not really that relevant now.
Nope. Is there like a live board that we can use to like draw like diagrams and
Illustrate this?
stuff?
Well,
Well, I can't
Sure.
fucking illustrate shit because
Yeah,
I'm
it's
on a
not
laptop, man.
neat.
Oh. Like there's a
I mean, like, this is what you would. The only way to illustrate this actually is just through a relational matrix.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. Also in Cell, you could do a simple. That's not Cell. Is it?
Excel?
Excel, yeah.
Yeah.
You could do a simple matrix there of, like, relation of commodity A to B, and probably do that within 3.
Yeah.
But either way, value, since it is labor time, if it goes up or lowers equivalently for both sides, then the relationship of relative value does not change. One coat is still worth, 2 gloves or whatever. That is, if all things rise to that proportion. So value has changed, but relative the relative value, the relative expression has not changed. And the relative expression can change without value itself changing. Oh wait, was it? Thus, real changes in the magnitude of value are neither unequivalent nor exhaustively reflected in the relative expression, that is, in the equation expressing the magnitude of relative value. The relative value of a commodity may vary, although its value remains constant. Alright, which was the example that had that? Yeah, it was an example too. So, relative value can change without value changing, but it's only for one side. If one side remains constant, its own relative value can change because the value of the other, which it relates to, has changed. So, this is both taken from just the single commodities perspective as well as the dual perspective of both. Yeah, basically just autistic relations that happen. Really not much of an interesting thing. Although it has to be something that must be said to
Yeah, it still
elaborate the
happens.
logical things.
And the opposite is true as well.
So 3, the equivalent form of value. We have seen that commodity A, the linen, by expressing its value in the use value of a commodity differing in kind, the coat, at the same time impresses upon the latter a specific form of value, namely that of the equivalent. The commodity linen manifests its quality of having a value by the fact that the coat, without having assumed a value form indifferent from its bodily form, is equated to linen. The fact that the latter, therefore, has a value is expressed by saying that the coat is directly exchangeable with it. Therefore, when we say that a commodity is in the equivalent form, we express the fact that it is directly exchangeable with other commodities. When one commodity, such as a coat, serves as the equivalent of another, such as linen, and coats consequently acquire the characteristic property of being directly exchangeable with linen, we are far from knowing in what proportion the two are exchangeable. The value of the linen being given in magnitude, the proportion depends on the value of the coat. Whether the coat serves as the equivalent in linen as relative value, or the linen as the equivalent in the coat as relative value, the magnitude of the coat's value is determined independently of its value form by the labor time necessary for its production. But whenever the coat assumes in the equation of value the position of equivalent, its values acquires no quantitative expression. On the contrary, the commodity coat now figures only as a definite quantity of some article. Are we all sure about what he means by equivalent and the relative form here?
I mean, he's going to explain it in the next paragraph, so. It says here, for instance, 40 yards of linen are worth what? 2 coats, because the commodity coat here plays the part of equivalent, because the used value coat counts as an embodiment of value vis-a-vis the linen. A definite number of coats is sufficient to express a definite quantity of value in the linen. 2 coats can therefore express the magnitude of value of 40 yards of linen, but they can never express the magnitude of their own value. Yeah. Yeah, because they had a superficial conception of this fact, i.e., because they considered that in the equation of value, the equivalent always has the form of a simple quantity of some article, of a use value. Bailey and many of his predecessors and followers were misled into seeing the expression of value as merely a quantitative relation. And he has a footnote here. The most superficial form of exchange value, that is a qualitative relation in which commodities exchange with one another, constitutes, according to Bailey, their value. Whereas, in fact, the equivalent form of the commodity contains no qualitative of determinate value. Man.
Yeah, that is the collapsing of value into exchange value,
Yeah.
which is typical, So, to finish off the paragraph, the truth being that when a commodity acts as equivalent, no quantitative determination of its value is expressed. So, if you have an equation of, A equals B, the first one is always the equivalent, the other one is the relative form. The equivalent form is, I don't know why he calls it the equivalent form.
What would you call it?
I don't know. Equivalent just seems to be like the opposite, in which I guess. No, actually, it makes sense. It's just really weird at first. It's equivalent because the other thing is equivalent to it.
Yeah.
And it is equivalent to the other thing.
It's relative to the other thing.
And the other one is relative as equivalent to it. So, A equals B is, A is worth like 2B. 2B are worth 1A. But if you just say A, he says when a commodity acts as equivalent, no quantitative determination of its value is expressed. If you say A is worth, well, you gotta say it's worth something else. You can't say A is worth 1A. Or 1A is worth 1A. But you're not saying anything. There's no determination being made.
equivalent to itself.
So there's that. The first peculiarity that strikes us in considering the form of the equivalent is this: use value becomes the form of manifestation, the phenomenal form of its opposite value. I guess. I mean, it was already explicit, if not implicit. I thought it was already pretty explicit. The fact that we begin with commodities and we can only have talked about this through commodities, you know, we haven't been talking about value as such. Continuing, the bodily form of the commodity becomes its value form. But mark well that this quid pro quo exists in the case of any commodity B, only when some other commodity A enters into a value relation with it, and then only within the limits of this relation. Since no commodity can stand in the relation of equivalent to itself, and thus turn its own bodily shape into the expression of its own value, every commodity is compelled to choose some other commodity for its equivalent, and to accept the use value, that is to say, the bodily shape of that other commodity, as the form of its own value. This also counts for money, by the way, in which the value of money cannot be measured in itself. You know, one can't say, it's like it's worth $10. Well, what are $10 worth? They're not worth $10. The value of money itself must be expressed in something else, just like any other commodity.
Yeah, money's just a medium for exchange, obviously. But otherwise, if there was nothing to use it for, it would just be paper.
Well, not only that, it's not just a medium. It's a very specific, special commodity itself. Because in that case, all commodities function as that medium of exchange, but the money is a universal medium, the universal commodity.
Because there's nothing really, unless someone's not willing to sell it or something, that money can't buy. Like no object. Everything has to be expressed in an amount of money.
So one of the measures that we apply to commodities as material substances as use values will serve to illustrate this point. A sugar loaf, being a body, is heavy and therefore has weight, but we can neither see nor touch this weight. We then take various pieces of iron whose weight has been determined beforehand. The iron as iron is no more the form of manifestation of weight than is the sugar loaf. Nevertheless, in order to express the sugar loaf as so much weight, we put it into a weight relation with the iron. In this relation, the iron officiates as a body representing nothing but weight. A certain quantity of iron therefore serves as the measure of the weight of the sugar and represents, in relation to the sugar loaf, weight embodied, the form of manifestation of weight. This part is played by the iron only within this relation, into which the sugar or any other body whose weight has to be determined enters with iron. Were they not both heavy, they could not enter into this relation. The one could therefore not serve as the expression of the weight of the other. When we throw both into the scales, we see in reality that as weight they are both the same, and that therefore, when taken in proper proportions, they have the same weight. Just as the substance of iron as the measure of weight represents in relation to the sugar loaf weight alone, so in our expression of value the material object, coat, in relation to linen, represents value alone. So that was an interesting, where he says the iron as iron is no more the form of manifestation of weight than is the sugar loaf. He's kind of taking a dig at Hegel, I think. You know, it's typical idealist thing. Which is funny because Hegel would say that doesn't count since these aren't real concepts. No, purely relative concepts are not real concepts. So there is no manifestation of weight, so-called. Weight is just this relative is nothing more than just exactly that relative measure that we made up. But when I first read this, I thought it was like it just kind of really fascinated me because I'd never thought about that. You know, what is like a pound in itself? Well, a pound is just like an arbitrary measure we made up, and then everything else now it is relative to that. It's the same thing with like all measures are arbitrary measures and don't exist in themselves. Like there is no such thing as length in itself. Length is only length compared to other lengths.
There's no reason as to why the alphabet is in the order in which it is in, right?
Nope.
But then there is no reason as to why our words in the orders in which they are in now, right? Or is there an order to words?
No, there is a reason for the grammar of words. We every society has to find a way to talk at least in concepts. How we arrange that concepts and how we relate that is arbitrary. Just like how like the order of the subject, object, and those things. But you still have to do like the relations between those.
You know what the subject and object are, and it's defined in each language, even if it's not the same. Jackslop, stop being postmodern. Jackslops, what's heavier, a pound of steel or a pound of feathers?
A pound of feathers, because feathers are lighter than steel.
All right. Yeah, that's true. Let's go on.
All right. I would say a joke here about a really old meme, but it's kind of dirty, so I won't. So continuing here, however, the analogy ceases. The iron in the expression of the weight of the sugar loaf represents a natural property common to both bodies, namely their weight, but the coat in the expression of value of the linen represents a non-natural property of both, something purely social, namely their value. So that's important. Purely social. Value is purely social. As such, economics is going to be purely social and nothing to do with any natural characters. Since the relative form of value of a commodity, the linen, for example, expresses the value of that commodity as being something wholly different from its substance and properties, as being, for instance, coat-like, we see that this expression itself indicates that some social relation lies at the bottom of it. With the equivalent form is just the contrary. The very essence of this form is that the material commodity itself, the coat, just as it is, expresses value, and is endowed with the form of value by nature itself.
Yep.
Oh, snap. Emerly, this holds good only within the value relation, in which the commodity linen is related to the commodity coat as its equivalent. 22. Determinations of reflection. Reflection bestimugen? I don't know how to pronounce that. Yeah. I'll have to type that out for you.
Yeah. It's
determinations of reflection of this kind,
in Hegel.
Are altogether very curious. For instance, one man is king only because other men stand in relation to subjects to him. On the other hand, imagine that they are subjects because he is king.
What?
And this is because Hegel, Science of Logic, where the determinations of reflection are stated to be not of a qualitative kind, but determinatedness, which are themselves relations.
Yeah.
Or determinateness.
That's getting off into Hegel, but like the point is that like why is he the king? Well, because the subjects identify him as the king, and they identify themselves as the subjects of the king because they identify the king as the king.
Yeah.
So they stand in relation to him.
Mm-hmm.
But they're relative to each other.
You shall no longer. You can no longer be a slave so long as you keep thinking you're a slave.
Okay.
We're all
so-
slaves. King
I
slave.
mean, that
to the
just goes to
relation.
show you, the interpretation that Lenin had about that. This kind of stuff went from being to essence. Essence relations appear just pretty quickly. This is one of them. Things have value because of the other, but the other has value because of the other.
Yeah.
Okay, continuing. Of course, this holds good only so long as the value relation exists in which the code stands in the position of the equivalent to the linen. Since, however, the properties of a thing are not the result of its relations to other things, but only manifest themselves in such relations, the coat seems to be endowed with its equivalent form, its property of being directly exchangeable, just as much by nature as it is endowed with the property of being heavy, or the capacity to keep us warm. Hence the enigmatical character of the equivalent form which escapes the notice of the bourgeois political economist, until this form, completely developed, confronts him in the shape of money. He then seeks to explain away the mystical character of gold and silver by substituting for them less dazzling commodities, and by reciting with ever renewed satisfaction the catalogue of all possible commodities which at one time or another have played the part of equivalent. He has not the least suspicion that the most simple expression of value, such as 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, already propounds the riddle of the equivalent form for our solution.
So it doesn't really matter if the coat goes up in price and they say, well, I'm not trading a coat for 20 yards of linen, I'll trade it for 25 yards of linen. Because we have money to exchange. So now only the money amount needs to go up or down, depending.
Well, no, I think he's just talking about a more general point about the nature of money, that the equivalent form is the beginning of the logical appearance of what can be counted as money.
Yeah.
In that, if you have A equals B, B is the value of A. It has value because of A. Therefore, so A is the absolute value upon which they are relative to.
I was talking about something else you said.
Yeah, I noticed. I have no idea what you were talking about because I don't know where in this paragraph it was.
It's this paragraph, but it just made me think that because he said where its property of being directly exchangeable. Like the point at which they would no longer be exchangeable would be if the coat manufacturer was like, I'm not going to trade my coats for 20 yards of linen anymore. I want more, or vice versa. Well, it wouldn't matter if there were money involved because they could just get the amount of money they need, which is more or less whatever. Sorry, I was just thinking, like, my brain went off in a different direction, I guess.
Yeah, so it's just like a bit of a dense paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
So, since the relative form of value, it's the top of the paragraph. Again, it's the relative form of value of a commodity. The linen, for example, expresses the value of that commodity as being something wholly different from its substance and properties, as being, for instance, coat-like. We see that this expression indicates that some social relation lies at the bottom of it, merely because it's a relational consideration.
Yeah. You're not exchanging your own linen for your own coat.
Well, it's not just that. It's you're also not exchanging the same thing. It has to be. It's automatically relational. Therefore, one can make later abstractions about social relational. Obviously, it's already been social relational because subjects are the ones exchanging. But this basically just proves that the value thing is not itself some absolute independent thing that's already there, even though that's how it seems to appear.
Yeah.
So with the equivalent form, it is just the contrary. The very essence of this form is that the material commodity itself, the coat, just as it is, expresses value and is endowed with a form of value by nature itself. So that the value of of a coat is expressed in 2 gloves, the way that's even thought of in that sentence is already treating it as if it was something within the coat which expresses in the 2 gloves, and that's what makes it fetishistic, mystified, like it's emanating from the object itself, rather than being something that exists in the relation of the two. So, of course, this holds good only so long as the value relation exists in which the coat stands in the opposition of equivalent to the linen. Since, however, the properties of a thing are not the result of its relations to other things, but only manifest themselves in such relations, the coat seems to be endowed with its equivalent form, its property of being directly exchangeable, just as much by nature as it is endowed by the property of being heavy, or the capacity of keeping us warm, to keep us warm. So that's the beginnings of the critique of fetishism. It's fetishism is at the end of this chapter, but this already here is a critique of fetishism, the belief that value is inherent to things.
You haven't gone into the Aristotle part, have you?
No.
Okay.
But I do remember chrematistics.
Yeah, because I'm seeing it right now, and I'm seeing these like elvish runes in my book, and I can't make heads or tails out of it.
So, hence the enigmatical character of the equivalent form, which escapes the notice of the bourgeois political economist until this form, complete developed, confronts him in the shape of money. He then seeks to explain away the mystical character of gold and silver by substituting for them less dazzling commodities, and by reciting with ever renewed satisfaction the catalogue of all possible commodities which at one or another have played the part of equivalent. So I think the enigmatical character of the equivalent form, which escapes the notice of the bourgeois political economist, has to be the universality of money, which seems to express its value in everything else. In which money literally can manifest in goods, not just as an after the fact, but literally as commanding their very coming to be. You pay someone and say, okay, cut my lawn. Well, your lawn wasn't cut already, but now it's about to be cut because you started with money. So now money is manifest as, your lawn being cut. You went to the baker or whatever, they hadn't yet baked a dozen donuts or whatever. And you pay the money,
Assuming
and then
the
do it.
The labor is honest.
Yeah, and then you pay them, and then they do it, and then the object comes to be. And so, what does it seem like to you? Well, from that perspective, it seems like the money has caused things. It's the value in money which is manifesting the things.
Would you call that risk if it doesn't emanate right on time? Where you see if you because that's the investor, you're investing in some person's labor to cut your grass, and that's where the exchange comes in, because when his part of the deal finishes, the cut grass is imminent. It just it arrives. So yeah, that happens. But when you're transferring over your cash over to some person, it doesn't immediately happen either, because he could just walk out and not cut your grass.
Yeah, but you keep a shotgun. The social contract is absolute, especially in the Wild West, Texas.
But then that means that there is risk towards entrepreneurship and stuff, because you're essentially giving your cash to X person to make a company, and then that money is then realized in said company, right? But then if he runs with the money, then there's some sort of inherent risk to you giving money to some other person, and therefore these capitalists are quote unquote correct.
Oh, about risk? Well, yeah. I've thought that since I read this, and like risk is real. I don't know why people but the capitalism isn't risk. Now risk is real for them as much as for it's less for them because they got a ton more money. But it's also real for them as much as it is for us. More so for, like, the worker has risks, the capitalist has risk. There's trust. There's got to be some measure of trust in the whole system, otherwise the whole system falls apart. If everybody's just a backstabbing, like stealing from each other, like, you're not gonna have an economy. But that has nothing to do with what was talking about here. So we'll just leave that for some.
Is that
something
one
else.
reason why and caps can't work? They're constantly backstabbing each other.
But you're having your own private police force, so.
But you can't, because you can't trust your own police force. You can't even trust yourself at some point.
I don't know. That's the problem with
just
socialism as well. Like, how do you trust, the people in the government? How do you trust your fucking neighbors? You just do. Alright, so continuing on this really autistic section. The body of the commodity that serves as the equivalent of figures as the materialization of human labor in the abstract, and is at the same time the product of some specifically useful concrete labor. This concrete labor becomes, therefore, the medium of expressing abstract human labor. If on the one hand the coat ranks as nothing but the embodiment of abstract human labor, so on the other hand tailoring, which is actually embodied in it, counts as nothing but the form under which that abstract labor is realized. In the expression of value of the linen, the form under which that abstract labor is... If in the expression of value of the linen, the unity of the tailoring consists not in making clothes, but in making an object which we at once recognize to be value, and therefore to be a congelation of labor, but of labor indistinguishable from that realized in the value of the linen. In order to act as such a mirror of value, the labor of the tailoring must reflect nothing besides its own abstract quality of being human labor generally. So now it's not, now he's specified it's not just human labor, but it's abstract human labor, which is value. To which I just repeat my own criticisms that this is not logically nor empirically true. There's plenty of things which aren't made by anybody which have value, and deal with it.
Nature. Trees have value. But they can be planted by humans, right? Yeah.
No, it's not like about just nature. It's just like value arise. Commodities arise out of one property. Like, you gotta have, if somebody has property, they can exchange it. Value then arises in the relationship of one commodity to another, and there has to be no labor necessary at all for anything. You could have just grown up in a place where a bunch of fucking apple trees grew, and somebody says, I want to buy an apple tree, and you're like, okay, paying $50. Upon what basis are you using for that? None, except for, like, let's see how much this moron is willing to pay.
Yeah.
And if they agree to pay, they agree to pay, and guess what? That's his value. There's no mystery to it. You can't say, well, I grew the trees. No, you didn't. You didn't plant it. Well, I watered the trees. No, you didn't. They just fucking grew on your property. But hey, somebody else wants it. They want to uproot and do the whole work of getting it. All you got to do is say, it's my property. Can't take it without my consent. Got to give me something. So, continuing. In tailoring as well as in weaving, human labor power is expended. Both, therefore, possess the general property of being human labor, and may, therefore, in certain cases, such as in the production of value, have to be considered under this aspect alone. There is nothing mysterious in this, but in the expression of value there is a complete turn of the tables. For instance, how is the fact to be expressed that weaving creates the value of the linen? Not by virtue of being weaving as such, but by reason of its general property of being human labor, simply by opposing the weaving that the other particular form simply by opposing tool weaving that other particular form of concrete labor, in this instance tailoring, which produces the equivalent of the product of weaving. Just as the code in its bodily form became a direct expression of value, so now does tailoring, a concrete form of labor, appears as direct and palpable embodiment of human labor generally. And this comes in the typical way. An hour of labor is worth an hour of labor. People, which I
Hyperion, did you interject
find.
already? Interject, please.
It's fine.
Talk about your commodity fetishism.
Do you want me to?
Yes.
No.
Okay, I didn't think you did.
So I don't know. I think socialists in general have a problem with this. Say an hour of labor is an hour of labor, and an hour of a doctor's labor is not any more or less than an hour of a janitor's labor, which is complete bullshit in my opinion. It's not that janitors don't deserve a living wage. No, it's just that the only time you can say that is you abstract from everything and just say, well, time is worth time.
I actually tried doing that for the whole labor time coin thing that I was trying to do.
But then again, I mean, here's where you can see that he's coquetting with Hegel. All these times where he says, oh, by the way, and then, but, when you would think about it this way, it appears to be that things are the expressions of these abstract things. There, he's obviously doing the whole he's kind of aping Hegel, but he's doing it in a very bad way, which is not faithful at all to what Hegel really says about these things, or things in this manner. It's a typical materialist thing. So continuing, hence the second peculiarity of the equivalent form is that concrete labor becomes the form under which its opposite, abstract human labor, manifests itself. Let's see, what was the first peculiarity? Oh yeah, that abstract, that value manifests as concrete use values. And the other one is that abstract labor manifests as concrete labor, which is not a necessary one, since at least not here. It becomes sort of a necessary thing, but it kind of plays with the way my value works, which value then manifests value as money, put forth by capital, employs labor power. Labor power is a commodity. The commodity then realizes itself. So value is realized in the potential commodity of labor power. That is then realized in the concrete commodities of the use values as well as the labor itself. So yeah, it works. But because this concrete labor tailoring in our case ranks as and is directly identified with undifferentiated human labor, it also ranks as identical with any other sort of labor, and therefore with that embodied in the linen. Consequently, although like all other commodity-producing labor, it is labor of private individuals, yet at the same time it ranks as labor directly social in its character. This is the reason why it results in a product directly exchangeable with other commodities. We have then a third peculiarity of the equivalent form, namely that the labor of private individuals takes the form of its opposite, labor directly social in its form. So, okay, this is interesting. So consequently, although like all other commodity producing labor, it is the labor of private individuals, yet at the same time it ranks as labor directly social in its character. So this would only work if we had the Adam Smith situation of we're all independent producers, we don't depend on the market, and we only come to market with things which just happen to be excesses that we have and that, we can trade away for other things. So, we produce our corn, we produce our potatoes, our chickens, whatever. We have enough to survive, and then we have a bit more, and we take that bit more to market. It wasn't originally intended to be for anybody else. It was intended to be for me. But I can take it to market, and suddenly it becomes a social thing. Because that's the only time this labor is actually private. No other time is this labor actually private. Because once you're in the market economy, the fact that you work for a wage, the fact that you're already producing within firms, the fact that you begin a firm with the explicit aim of producing something for sale already makes what you're doing social. At least social in principle, if not in reality. Because it could be that you were aiming to produce something which people wanted, but which people didn't want. Therefore, your business fails, etc. So consequently, although like all of the commodity producing labor, it is labor of private individuals, yet at the same time it ranks as labor is directly social in its character. This is the reason why it results in a product directly exchangeable with other commodities. Which I don't agree with. It's not the labor that makes it directly exchangeable with other commodities. It's the sociality. What makes it directly exchangeable is that somebody else wants it. It doesn't matter if you produce it. It doesn't matter if you do. It doesn't matter how you produce it, how long it took you to produce. What makes it social is the real social aspect, that somebody else in society wants what you've done. Because you can't go from a private individual labor in which you're just producing for yourself and you say, oh well, I got all this excess, I'm going to take it to the market. It's like, hey guys, I got valuable goods here, and people just look at you like with a weird eye. You made some kind of weird shit that nobody wants, and too bad. Oh, but it has my individual concrete labor, which is abstract human labor, right? No. It's not how it works. Somebody's got to want it, otherwise it's not valuable. It doesn't have any exchangeability.
That's why we say value is retroactive valuation at the market or, during exchange or whatever. It has to be valuable to someone. For example, I was at the store and my mother was like, I'm not buying this because it's too much. And I was like, well, I was like, why? And she was like, the price isn't worth it. And I was like, well, yeah, it's only worth it if you pay for it. Otherwise, it doesn't have any worth. It just sits on the shelf.
Yeah, the only reason it seems to people that it seems that there are objective values as such in themselves is because there's other people who do value it. So, even if you don't value it, supposing that, you wanted to like be some kind of merchant or something, however that was, you could buy things that you didn't think were valuable to you, but which were valuable to other people, and exchange those. So, reiterating that last point, we have then a third peculiarity of the equivalent form, namely that the labor of private individuals takes the form of its opposite, labor directly social in its form. And it's not necessarily true. It's not necessarily false, but also not necessarily true. And that this could be true if we have like what I was saying. You producing just for yourself, and then you have an excess, and then you take it to market, and somebody wants it, and is willing to pay for it. And suddenly it's like, oh, it was a private thing for me, but now it's a social thing. By virtue that somebody wanted it, not by virtue of the fact that it's a product of my labor or there's some abstract human labor that can't be true. But it's also the case that in our current society, a lot of what goes on is not private labor at all. It is labor aimed at social consumption, is a labor already aimed at creating something for others to consume with the express intent and as studies necessary. A lot of them do they spend a ton of money on just like marketing research of like how many people do you think want this, how many people do you think are going to like willing to pay, how high are they willing to pay, etc. So companies like spend a lot of time studying that shit and bringing stuff to market, in which like they're already pretty sure that they've got something that is definitely social. It's not just a guessing game. They're not it's not like the wacky entrepreneur who also it can't just be guessing. The guessing game would be like the ideal of the entrepreneur is like they come up with some invention or some shit, and they're like, wow, well, if I bet people would want this if they just knew about it. And then they go out and, they start fucking marketing their shit and door to door and annoying you and whatnot. And some people may want it, some people may not. And perhaps it comes that, what they made it right now is not useful, but like 10 years down the line, they finally find a use for it. And all of a sudden now it's socially useful labor that was carried on. But wage labor, productions within capital is already not private labors, by the way. That's already social labor. When you go to to work for a capitalist in a factory or whatever, warehouse, whatever it is, you do some sort of production or labor. That's already social. You're already being paid. That's already the mark of sociality. You're not guessing. Even if your company doesn't make a profit and they go under, you got paid for your labor. Your labor was necessary. The products that they made, however, were not. So we'll leave it at that. That's my critique of that. Continuing, the two latter peculiarities of the equivalent will become more intelligible if we go back to the great thinker who was the first to analyze so many forms, whether of thought, society, or nature, and amongst them also the form of value. I mean Aristotle. See, how many people do you think even know about Aristotle in fucking economics?
Yeah, they probably don't read him that much.
They probably don't read him at all.
Well, economics students have to take some philosophy courses, don't they?
Yeah, but
I thought
nobody teaches fucking
probably
Aristotle
not. Maybe
nowadays.
not Aristotle. Yeah, true. They should.
It's like any other teacher. A bad teacher of Aristotle will just like ruin Aristotle for you.
Yeah. That's why someone I know said that Plato sucks, because I guess she was taught badly. You need a good teacher, or to read him on your own with diligence.
So continuing, in the first place, he clearly enunciates that that the money form of commodities is only the further development of the simple form of value, that is, of the expression of the value of one commodity in some other commodity taken at random. For he says, 5 beds equals 1 house. A bunch of Greek letters. Can't read Greek. Too bad, so sad. For he says, 5 beds equals 1 house is not to be distinguished from 5 beds equals so much money. He further sees that the value relation which gives rise to this expression makes it necessary that the house should qualitatively be made equal to the bed, and that without such an equalization these two clearly different things could not be compared with each other as commensurable quantities. Exchange, he says, cannot take place without equality, and equality not without commensurability. Here, however, he comes to a stop and gives up the further analysis of the form of value. It is, however, in reality impossible that such unlike things can be commensurable, that is, qualitatively equal. Such an equalization can only be something foreign to their real nature, consequently only a makeshift for practical purposes. Aristotle, therefore, himself tells us what barred the way to his further analysis. It was the absence of any concept of value. What is that equal something, that common substance, which admits the value of the beds being expressed by a house? Such a thing in truth cannot exist, says Aristotle. And why not? Compared with beds, the house does represent something equal to them, insofar as it represents what is really equal, both in the beds and the house. And that is, human labor. That is human desire. There was, however, an important fact which prevented Aristotle from seeing that to attribute value to commodities is merely a mode of expressing all labor as equal human labor, and consequently as labor of equal quality. Greek society was founded upon slavery and had therefore its natural basis the inequality and had therefore for its natural basis the inequality of men and their labor powers. Sorry, let me reread that sentence again. Greek society was founded upon slavery and had therefore for its natural basis the inequality of men and of their labor powers. The secret of the expression of value, namely, that all kinds of labor are equal and equivalent because, and so far as they are human labor in general, cannot be deciphered until the notion of human equality has already acquired the fixity of a popular prejudice. This, however, is possible only in a society in which the great mass of the produce of labor takes the form of commodities, in which consequently the dominant relation between man and man is that of owners of commodities. The brilliancy of Aristotle's genius is shown by this alone, that he discovered in the expression of the value of commodities a relation of equality. The peculiar conditions of the society in which he lived alone prevented him from discovering what in truth was at the bottom of this equality. So that's a good little paragraph on Marxist materialism. So that's the end of section 3. What do you guys think about that?
Good. I just like any reference to Aristotle.
Well, what do you think about what he says about why Aristotle couldn't figure out what value was?
Well, he's probably right. There are too many different factors. Did everyone leave? Oh, sorry. I don't know what Steam's or Discord is doing.
Well, I can hear you.
Yeah. Well, no one else said anything.
There's a reason why I'm in Solaris.
Oh, okay. Well, I forgot. I just saw you sign on. Well, all right. This is a good section.
Well, I mean, I disagree with him on the Aristotle thing.
Disagree?
It wasn't just because they didn't see the equality of labor, because ultimate value is not the equality of labor. Although it does have to do with labor in that in capitalism, labor becomes something universalizable within capital, but not as such. So capitalist labor, so to say, is universal, but it's not universal according to itself, but universal according to value.
I think that's what he's assuming, obviously. I don't think he's just saying labor that isn't social or under capitalism.
Well, yeah, but he's wrong then, because it's not labor that is social that is valuable. It's value as desire which makes it valuable.
All right, dig him up and tell him he's wrong.
I would. I think he'd appreciate it, quite frankly.
Yeah, he would. Definitely. He was a good guy that admitted his faults, changed accordingly.
And I mean, it's obvious why he has this bent towards labor, because he's had this hard-on for labor his entire life. Like, from the 1844 manuscripts of his youth all the way to Capital, like, he's always had this fix on labor and materialism. And so when in political economy, he finds that there is a bias in classical political economy towards labor as, the source of all value, as the substance of all value. I mean, he just latches onto it and he never lets it go, even though it ultimately really just, it doesn't make sense. But boy, he takes it to the limits of stretching the meaning of that labor and how it makes sense, how he rationalizes it. But yeah, we'll leave it at that. We'll continue with subsection 4 next time. The elementary form of value considered as a whole. See you next time.